Understand this, Eric Garner was not resisting arrest. There was no reason to arrest him. I get that he sells cigarettes, but there was no proof, no evidence that he was selling cigarettes that day, at that moment. It's just that these officers had a history with him, and I think they became personally involved with Mr. Garner. They have a history with him. They see him out there all the time, and maybe this day they just didn't feel like seeing him out there. And so that's why we hear him say, I'm tired of this. This stops today, because that day he was doing nothing. But the nerve of you, Mr. Garner, to not do what I say, right? I'm going to take this personal. If I give you an order, you're bound to do it. Well, police officers are not the end all and the be all. And so we don't have that ultimate authority, even though some might assert that they do. And so he had an absolute right to say, I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to be detained. I don't want to be handcuffed. I'm doing nothing. He was not under arrest, so he could not resist something that he was not under. But that little officer who first encountered him could not control him. And I think Pantaleo came to his defense, the little guy, and jumped on Eric Garner's back to show him, when I tell you to do something, you'll do it. You know, I talk about contempt of cop, right? They told him to do something. He didn't do it. There was a price to pay, and that price was he lost his life. Mike Brown was told to do something, and he didn't do it, and that price was the loss of life. And I know we're going to talk about Ezell Ford here in Los Angeles. Yeah. He was told to do something, and he didn't do it, and he lost his life. And so you don't get, as a police officer, that's not handcuffing you. You don't get to just make up rules and engage people willy-nilly, and then when they don't do what you say, punish them. You don't get to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and that's what they did with Eric Garner.
I believe that a policeman should be handcuffed if he's violating the law, just like a suspect if they're violating the law. And so I have no trouble with handcuffing people that are abusing their power, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about these guys.
And also, I think part of a police officer's job needs to be to diffuse any violent situation, and also to make a determination whether the individual that they're engaging with presents a danger to the community. Because the minute that the police use violence to take someone down, even if they're in the right, okay, they do place the community at risk. When a police officer pulls out his gun and begins shooting at a suspect, then they run the risk that they're going to miss the suspect and shoot an innocent bystander, or that the suspect will respond with the same deadly force and injure a citizen. So police are often in the situation to make that decision of whether or not to engage in a violent encounter. Police made the decision to engage in a violent encounter with Eric Garner, rather than they could have walked away, seen him another day. They could have dropped a ticket in front of him. They could have perhaps talked to him, had him sign a ticket and go to court and discuss it there. And this is also, I think, probably true of Ezell Ford, and it's my opinion that it is absolutely true of what happened between Darren Wilson and Mike Brown, is that Darren Wilson was in the position not to engage Mike Brown. He didn't have to chase him. He could have called for backup. My belief, based on what I know, and obviously people have decided differently, and a grand jury decided differently, but it is that Darren Nelson very possibly did shoot at Mike Brown as he ran away from him. And that's what caused the encounter to continue, rather than let the 15-year-old boy run away. What's really the danger there to you? And get the police on him, give a description, let him get arrested at another time. But I think the police are creating these situations that are not only putting suspects at risk and resulting in their deaths, but also do ultimately put the community at risk as well, and themselves.
Well, I think the prosecutor in the Mike Brown case did a very fine job of being one of the few prosecutors to convince a grand jury not to indict, and by presenting selective evidence. And I think there is ample evidence for that. So I really, in terms of looking at that grand jury, I look at it with the same kind of jaundiced eye that you do as well.
And Eric Garner as well.
Yes.
The same grand jury in New York also chose not to indict.
Let's add another sad name to that list, and I think it's quite extraordinary. At least we are living in a time where we're remembering the names of people that were the victims of excessive use of force by police officers, and there was a time where nobody even talked about this issue, so at least we've moved slightly forward, although there is so much extreme and severe pushback from police officers trying to make us, in sort of the vein of Donald Trump, be afraid for our own safety. Either we capitulate to their use of force and their breaking of the law, or we will have no law enforcement. And I think that's what's happening in this argument. And I refuse to frame the argument, have the argument framed up in that respect and in that way. Could you talk a little about the LAPD and Ezell Ford before we close out this episode?
Ezell Ford is a mentally ill young man who was stopped by Los Angeles Police Department gang officers last year, shortly after the Mike Brown incident on 65th and Broadway. And the officers factually had no reason to detain him. It's that probable cause, that reasonable suspicion that they manufactured in the detention of Ezell Ford. And most recently, the Los Angeles Police Commission, through their investigation, concurred that the officers had no legitimate reason to detain Ezell Ford. And I've said all along that absent probable cause, reasonable suspicion, everything that happened after that detention is problematic. And so Ezell Ford was killed at the hands of 2 LAPD officers. And so now what's going on is that the president of the Los Angeles Police Protective League, a lieutenant of police by the name of Craig Lawley, was so upset by the decision of the police commission that he sought out the mother of Ezell Ford, contacted her via her private email to express his displeasure with this finding. And I, as a mother, find that outrageous. This woman has lost her son. And if you have issue with the finding of the police commission, then you should take that up with them. To contact this woman in any fashion is outrageous. And so I am hoping that Police Chief Charlie Beck will do the right thing, initiate a personnel complaint against Lieutenant Craig Lawley for conduct unbecoming an officer, at the very minimal, for contacting this woman, and make sure that he stops. Because in the last 6 weeks, Craig Lawley seems to be singularly focused on the Ford family, and he has been commenting on a blog. Commenting on a blog that he has through the Los Angeles Police Protective League about Ezell Ford. He's saying that Ezell Ford is a gang member, that he is a former drug user, and he may very well be all of that, but you don't get to kill him for that. You don't get to stop him and want to engage him, LAPD, in an investigative stop and then ramp that up, escalate that up to a deadly force incident. And so that's where we are. And I'm just really bothered by the fact that this woman and her family are being taunted. Outrageous.
Now, let me just say this, just to top off what Cheryl just said. According to the Los Angeles Times, the police commission ruled that although the officer may have been in a fight for his life after stopping this man, Ezell, the commission decided that he did not have a reason to stop and detain Ford in the first place. His handling of the encounter, the commission concluded, was so flawed that it led to the fatal confrontation. And that is what this officer Lawley is complaining about, and actually calling the mother of the poor mom of her deceased, of the son who's been killed by the police, and complaining to her about what the police commission, and the police commission is set up to be a bit of a watchdog agency. I mean, that was the whole purpose behind it. And so I really think that for anybody that's upset about this, who could they write to? Should they write to Charlie Beck?
Well, absolutely. Write a letter to Charlie Beck, write a letter to the Los Angeles Police Commission, write a letter to Eric Garcetti, our mayor, and complain about the way that this officer is conducting himself. Because if you were the victim of, if you lost a loved one, for whatever reason, certainly you wouldn't expect to hear from the people who killed your loved one about their displeasure. And understand that the police commission is an independent review board.
Yes.
They're not there to co-sign everything that Chief Charlie Beck says. That would defeat the purpose of having them. And so I want for the Ford family this nonsense to stop yesterday.
Okay. Well, thank you both. Thank you for your eloquent words, you two as well, Mike. And thank you for having this discussion. Let's not sit back and be complacent and get used to this kind of behavior from our police department. We're not going to do that here in Los Angeles, so let's take some action. If you feel so moved, do it. It sounds to me like it's a situation where one of our fellow citizens is being mistreated by somebody whose salary we all pay. So I would suggest that if you are in agreement with us, that you take some action. And